Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and the other day, reading through my comments, I saw someone ask me in a video where I was discussing dips and pull-ups. They'd asked me, hey, is it possible for a person to build a pretty big upper body using nothing but dips and pull-ups, and obviously, weighted versions of them also so that you can progressively overload. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, guys. I guess where we need to go with this up front, when I answer questions like this is hypothetical. Even if I say yes that it's possible, I'm not suggesting that anyone who is really serious about their strength and development and everything else only do 2 exercises for half of their body. All right, so let's get that out of the way. I'm not suggesting that you do this or this is your recipe for success. The question becomes, is it possible, and are these good exercises for someone who wanted a relatively low exercise selection so they can get the most bang for their buck out of every single lift they do in the gym? Yeah, I'm going to say yes. And here's what we need to look at with these 2 lifts in terms of just exercise economy and effectiveness. So I don't want people to think that I'm saying, hey, this is what you need to go do. This is what I'm recommending, because I obviously do more than that. You guys have seen me do a ton of bench pressing, overhead pressing, all that stuff with a barbell. All right, so I don't even follow this. So let's get this out of the way first. But when you start looking at these 2 lifts, do they in combination pretty much work the entire upper body to a greater or lesser extent? And the answer is yes. Yes. And I'm going to go so far as to say is the only muscle we could really argue about in the upper body as to their effectiveness is going to be the side delt. Side delt. Now, we could argue things like the upper traps and stuff might not get maximized, the side delt might not get maximized, but in the grand scheme of things, is that going to prevent you from growing those muscles? No. Is that going to prevent you from growing anything else? No. Now, when people start talking about, well, they don't isolate anything, well, there's no actual real evidence to suggest that isolation is useful or necessary for muscle growth. And what I mean is, I'm not saying isolation movements don't cause the muscle you target to grow, but the actual act of trying to isolate them seems to have no benefits over a movement that works multiple muscles. In other words, the data doesn't seem to suggest that isolating a muscle causes it to grow faster. What the data suggests is that it causes other muscles to not grow as much. But it doesn't actually make the muscle you're training grow faster by trying to isolate it with an isolation movement versus a good compound movement. And that's kind of the point there, is that taking other muscles out doesn't make the target muscle grow faster. So hopefully that's a point people can clarify. But it does make the muscles you're taking out not grow as much. And hopefully that's an understandable concept. In other words, bench pressing might grow your triceps, your front delts, and your pecs, but flies only grow the pecs, maybe a little bit of front delt, and they don't really affect the triceps, right? Your triceps don't grow. It shouldn't be a difficult concept to understand. And by taking the triceps out, it doesn't mean that your chest grows faster. So when you look at what these 2 exercises do, dips have oftentimes been called the squats for upper body. When you start looking at the dip, what does it work? It works the entire chest, done effectively. I'm talking about if you do these exercises through their full effective range of motion. Effective range of motion. Doesn't even have to be the full as possible range of motion, just the full effective range of motion, the range of motion that really hits the muscles hardest. In this case, the dip is going down to about parallel. Lower, it can cause some shoulder compromising, and it might be a deeper stretch than you even need for maximum pec activation, and go ahead and locking it out at the top. All right, a dip works your entire chest. All right, it does work the entire chest depending upon your angle. It works the upper chest too. Maybe to a slightly lesser extent than it does the lower chest, but it lights it up. Hits all 3 heads of the tricep. Maybe the long head not quite as much, but it's not terrible on the long head as long as you get a good stretch on it. Works the front delts, works just a little bit of the rest of the delt, but it also works the lats a little bit more than a lot of other presses do. So there's a little bit of extra lat involvement, and then it works your abs and everything. There's some core involvement. So as far as working most of the upper body, it actually does work at least 50% of the muscle mass, if not more, in your upper body. All right? It does. And then you take the pull-up. And I'm talking about when you go to a dead hang at the bottom. A lot of that's obvious. Yeah, it works the lats, the rear delts, the rhomboids, middle traps, lower traps. Arguably not the upper traps as much, and arguably not the side delts as much, but they do get hit. What else doesn't work? Well, there's good data that pull-ups, actually, as far as any of your pulling motions go, are really good on the long head of your triceps. They seem to actually hit the triceps even better than a chin-up does, whereas in the chin-up hits the bicep a little bit better. We could argue about how much, though. Does it matter? Because when we start talking about total volume, as your volume increases, an exercise that's slightly less effective than another for activation on a given muscle, as volume starts to get higher, that starts to not matter so much. But what it does do is that it does hit the tricep a little better, and particularly hits that long head. It does work your upper chest at the bottom. Again, there's EMG data showing that the upper chest actually lights up on pull-ups and chin-ups both if you go low enough. It works your abs, works your core. Not the spinal erectors so much, so you need other lifts for that stuff, but they were getting into lower body at that point. But people want to argue about arm development. Okay, well, chin-up works the biceps a little more. But all the other muscles of the arm besides the bicep get worked harder on an overhand grip pull-up. Brachialis, radial brachialis, long head of the tricep. Which one's going to give you potential for more complete arm development if you were going to cut down to fewer exercises? Well, the pull-up, again, hits all those other muscles a bit better with the pronated grip and the stretch and everything involved. So between those two exercises, hasn't the entire upper body been worked? Yeah, you could develop pretty much maximum chest, lat, arm development. Only areas we might be lagging is a little bit of shoulder development, but that's a point of contention because a lot of people would say things like, well, the side delt isn't really intended to be worked as a primary mover directly the way that people do it. That's not really a normal function of the body, and in fact, done incorrectly, that has a really high injury rate. In other words, exercises that actually do utilize the side delt here, that lateral head, tend to also have really high injury rates on the shoulder joint. Why is that? Because they're not always the most natural of movements. People would argue it's not intended to be worked that way. I've seen coaches, and I'm including coaches who work with people who care about their physique. I've seen some argue. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this logic. This is a point I've made. I've had a lot of them claim that they get pretty good overall delt development if they just have their people do enough bench press and row volume, right? Well, I think we could argue that pull-ups and dips get similar levels of activation, and they've argued that, again, that middle head, because it's being worked a little bit both directions, it's really more of a stabilizer. It's still getting a decent amount of work. Is it getting enough to grow? Yeah. Is it enough to maybe get that maximum bodybuilder growth? Maybe not. Maybe not. I would say for a lot of people, very probably not. However, I've also met a couple of bodybuilders over the years, and bodybuilding's not my thing, it's not what I care about, who don't actually directly train their side delt, and they don't do any overhead pressing. Now, we could argue the drugs contributed, but they just, from doing rowing, rear delt work, bench press, various chest presses, had really massive delts. Now, drugs could play a role, which kind of comes to the other point we make when it comes to traps and the side delts and everything. Those are also the muscles most affected by drugs. The drug culture has essentially given people ideas about how much development they need to look right with those muscles. Well, that's where we get into an argument, don't we? So are we arguing about, could these exercises work everything other than maybe the muscles that get the most benefit from anabolics? In other words, are you going to look like the guy who's blasting a bunch of gear if you're not blasting gear and then doing these two exercises, your primary upper body movements? Well, maybe not. But I guess that's the question we have to ask, is that, are you just trying to build your upper body? If so, someone who's hypothetically asking this question, are they just trying to build their upper body, or are they trying to emulate the physique of the guys blasting a bit of gear? Well, I guess that's the real question you have to ask, don't you? Because if you're trying to emulate the proportions that they have without blasting gear, you're going to need to hammer those areas over and over and over. You're going to need to put a much, much, much heavier focus on those areas, because they have drugs that make those areas grow even if they don't train them, or that amplify any training signal they get there. So those guys tend to get big side delts and big traps without even the most effective exercises for them. and you're using exercises that maybe that's the only areas they might be lagging a little bit in. Maybe they're not giving maximum stimulation in those areas with enough volume. They're giving some. So that's the point we get to. So it comes down to, are you trying to look the way that the drug enhanced physique culture says you need to look, which is, again, most of YouTube fitness. That is most of YouTube fitness. Well, I guess that's a different question then. But as far as even the traps go, what else are you doing? I mean, people who are squatting, deadlifting, all that stuff on top of it, which a lot of people are thinking of as lower body exercises, they're going to give you some extra growth in that area. But I would say, barring maybe the side delts, maybe the upper traps, yeah, you could pretty well develop your entire upper body with these two exercises, given enough training volume and progressive overload, because they pretty well work 90 to 95% of the upper body as primary movers very, very effectively. Those two lifts, you've covered at least 90 to 95% of the muscle mass in your upper body. They have fantastic exercise economy. They're fantastic exercises. They move your body through space, so they not only help you with strength and size development, they're probably really good overall athletic movements for people who are just trying to be more fit and more athletic too. So what I would say to anyone out there who is asking, can they only do those two? Yeah, you could. I would say you probably need some other stuff in there, right? I would say for the majority of you, you do, but there's no reason you couldn't use those two exercises to really build the entire base of your upper body very, very effectively. And for people who've got the right genetics, yeah, you could probably look fantastic doing just those two on the upper body. For the guys who are genetically gifted, sure you could. Why couldn't you? They stimulate almost all of the muscle mass of the upper body very effectively, and they do it with really good exercise economy. And they're exercises that you can come in and do all the time, over and over and over. They're done correctly. They're relatively low impact on your joints and everything else. They don't really overtax all your connective tissue too bad. So you can get away with really high volumes of training on these two exercises. So when you look at the amount of muscle mass that they involve all at once concurrently, combined with exercise that you can actually train a pretty large amount of volume out of effectively, because again, connective tissue, recovery issues, all that other stuff, they tend to actually give you a really good trade-off on stimulation versus recovery. So yeah, they would be fantastic for people who are trying to be somewhat exercise minimalist and they just want to do a handful of exercises for developing your upper body, no doubt about it. They might leave one or two areas, depending upon the person, lagging a bit behind where you might want them, so you might need some other work for those areas. But I think they would get 90 to 95% of the job done for most of you out there. And they're definitely good choices as far as exercise economy goes. Absolutely. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.